The alarm echoed through every corridor of Galactic Unity Station like a wounded animal screaming for help. An ambassador. Kevin Park dropped his coffee cup the moment he heard it. He had been on this station for 3 years now, and he knew every alarm and every warning sound, but this one was different because this one meant something terrible had happened to children. Kevin ran through the metal hallways and his boots made loud sounds against the floor as other humans joined him, and they all moved toward the central council chamber where the emergency meeting was already starting. When he arrived, he saw chaos. 17 different alien species filled the massive room, and all of them were shouting and growling and clicking and making sounds that his translator device could barely keep up with, and Kevin had never seen anything like this in his entire career. Commander Thrak of the Valkyrie stood at the center of the room, and he was absolutely terrifying to look at because his species looked like 8-foot-tall bears covered in shiny black scales instead of fur, and his forearms were clenched into fists, and his red eyes burned with a rage that made even the bravest warriors step backward. "My daughter is missing," Thrak roared, and the sound shook the walls and made the lights flicker. Kevin watched as the massive alien turned to face the council, and his voice cracked with something Kevin had never heard from a Valkyrie before, and it was fear mixed with desperation. And it made Kevin's heart hurt. "She's only 6 cycles old," Thrak continued, and his scales had turned from black to a sickly gray color, which Kevin knew meant extreme distress in his species. "And I have searched everywhere, and she's gone, High Priestess." Melody of the Luminari floated forward, and she was beautiful in a way that made humans stop and stare, because her people were made of pure living light, and they glowed in colors that Earth had no names for, but right now her light was dim and flickering like a candle about to die. "3 of our younglings have also vanished," she said, and her voice sounded like bells ringing underwater. "And they did not return to their crystalline chambers for rest cycle. And we have searched and found nothing." Kevin felt his stomach drop, because this was not just one missing child, and this was not just one species. The Tetrani ambassador stepped forward next, and he was an insect-like creature with 6 legs and 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected everything like mirrors, and his clicking sounds were translated into words that made Kevin feel sick. "4 of our larvae have disappeared from the nursery pods," he said, and his antennae drooped low, which meant grief in his culture. "And they are too young to survive outside the humidity-controlled environment. And if we do not find them soon, they will die." A splash of water announced the arrival of Ambassador Coral of the Delphini, and she had risen from the aquatic tube that connected to the room, and her species looked like dolphins mixed with octopuses, and her normally bright blue skin had turned pale gray. "2 of our young swimmers are gone," she said, and water dripped from her body as she spoke, "and they cannot breathe outside water for more than a few hours, and we are running out of time." The Scarathi delegation made themselves known next, and they were bird people with 4 wings and sharp talons and feathers in every color of the rainbow, and the lead ambassador, named Wind Dancer, let out a screech that hurt Kevin's ears. 3 fledglings, she cried, and her feathers puffed out in distress. "And 3 of our precious fledglings have vanished, and their parents are destroying themselves with worry," Kevin counted quickly in his head, and his heart beat faster with each number, because 12 alien children were missing, and 12 young lives had somehow disappeared from a station that was supposed to be the safest place in the galaxy. Station security chief Brian Kim pushed through the crowd, and he was a tall man with a serious face and eyes that had seen too much in his 15 years of service, and he moved to stand beside Kevin. "We have checked everything," he said, and his voice was loud enough to cut through the noise, and every scanner and every camera and every sensor on this station has been activated, and we have found nothing." "How is that possible?" Thrak demanded, and he stepped toward Brian with murder in his eyes. "And my daughter did not simply vanish into empty space. Brian did not step back, even though the Valkyrie was twice his size and 3 times his weight, and Kevin felt proud of his fellow human in that moment. The camera showed the children moving through the station. During the evening rest cycle, Brian explained, and they seemed to be following each other, and they entered corridor 774, and then the footage becomes corrupted. Corrupted, Melody asked, and her light pulsed with suspicion. And how convenient. It is not convenient, Kevin said, and he stepped forward to stand beside Brian, and it is suspicious, and we are investigating, but I need everyone here to remain calm. Calm, Thrak roared, and the word came out like thunder, and you want me to remain calm while my daughter is missing, and while some monster on this station has stolen our children. I understand your fear, Kevin said, and he made his voice soft and gentle, even though his own heart was racing. And I am a father too, and I have a daughter back on Earth, and if anything happened to her, I would burn down worlds to find her. The room went quiet because the aliens had never heard a human speak like this before, and they had always thought humans were the soft and weak species who smiled too much and cried at sad stories. But I also know, Kevin continued, and he looked around the room at every species and met every eye that he could, and that panic will not find your children, and only clear thinking and cooperation will do that. Thrak stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his red eyes, and the rage was still there, but now it was controlled and focused. What do you suggest, human? He asked, and his voice was quieter. Now Kevin turned to Brian and nodded, and the security chief pulled up a holographic map of the station that floated in the center of the room. We search every section, Brian said, and he pointed to different areas as he spoke. And we divide into teams, and each team will have members from multiple species, and no area will be missed. And what about the human sections? Carl asked, and her voice held an edge of suspicion. And you have not mentioned those. Kevin felt the tension in the room spike, because the accusation was clear, and the alien ambassador was suggesting that humans might be responsible. We will search there too, Kevin said, and he kept his voice even, and in fact, I will personally lead the search of the human residential wing. The aliens looked at each other, and silent conversations happened through glances and gestures, and Kevin waited because he knew they needed to make this decision themselves. Very well, Thrak said finally, and we will do it your way, human. But if we do not find the children soon, and I will tear this station apart with my bare hands. Kevin nodded, and he believed every word because he would do the same thing. Brian began organizing teams, and Kevin watched as species that had never worked together before formed groups and moved out into the station. And the desperate search for 12 missing children had begun. Kevin grabbed Brian's arm before the security chief could leave and pulled him aside. The human wing, Kevin said quietly, and something tells me we need to look there first. Brian frowned, but nodded, and together the two humans left the council chamber and headed toward their own people's quarters. Neither of them knew what they would find there, but Kevin had a strange feeling in his gut, and it was the same feeling he got whenever something important was about to happen. The corridors of the human residential wing were quiet and peaceful, and Kevin walked through them with Brian at his side, and they checked room after room and found nothing unusual until they reached the section where Dr. Amy Lee lived. Kevin had met Amy a few times before, and she was a small woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice, and she worked as the station's pediatric xenobiologist, which meant she studied alien children and their development. He knocked on her door, and no one answered. Brian looked at Kevin, and Kevin nodded, and the security chief overrode the lock. The door slid open, and both humans froze in absolute shock at what they saw inside. Kevin Parks stood frozen in the doorway of Dr. Amy Lee's quarters, and his brain refused to accept what his eyes were showing him because it was the most unexpected thing he had ever seen in his entire life. The room had been completely transformed, and it no longer looked like a simple living space, but instead looked like something out of a dream. And everywhere, Kevin looked. He saw blankets and pillows and soft glowing lights and strange structures, built from fabric and furniture and sleeping peacefully inside this magical fortress were all 12 missing alien children. Brian made a small choking sound beside him, and Kevin understood exactly how he felt, because this was impossible and wonderful and terrifying all at the same time. Amy Lee sat in the center of the chaos on a pile of cushions, and she looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was messy and tangled, but she was smiling a soft and gentle smile as she watched over her sleeping charges. Oh, she said quietly when she noticed Kevin and Brian standing in the doorway, and I was going to send a message to the council, but they had just finally fallen asleep, and I did not want to wake them with the noise. Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, and he just stood there staring at the incredible scene before him. In one corner of the room, he saw Commander Thrax's daughter, and the young Valkyrie was curled up in a massive nest made of heated blankets and temperature-regulated padding, and her obsidian scales were reflecting soft rainbow colors from the gentle lights around her, and she was snoring peacefully. The sound she made was like a small earthquake, but somehow it was adorable, and Kevin felt his heart melt a little bit. Near the ceiling, 3 luminari younglings had claimed a specially constructed dark space that Amy had built from blackout fabric and frames, and inside the darkness, their soft amber glow was barely visible as they rested in a way that Kevin knew their species needed, because too much light actually hurt young luminari. Hanging from hooks attached to the ceiling were 4 silk cocoons that contained the Chitrani larvae, and the cocoons were connected to some kind of humidity system that Kevin could hear humming quietly, and mist occasionally escaped from small vents to keep the young insects comfortable. The Delphini children floated in 2 large, transparent bubbles filled with water, and the bubbles were connected to Amy's bathroom plumbing by tubes that kept the water fresh and moving, and inside the bubbles, the young swimmers drifted peacefully with their tentacles wrapped around stuffed toys that Amy must have given them. Above everything else, perched on a specially built platform near the ceiling, were the 3 Skarathi fledglings, and they had tucked their heads under their wings, and their feathers were fluffed up for warmth, and they made small chirping sounds in their sleep. Kevin finally found his voice, and it came out as a whisper because he did not want to disturb the sleeping children. How he asked simply. Amy looked up at him, and her tired eyes sparkled with warmth, and she gestured for the 2 men to step inside carefully. "It is a long story," she said, and her voice was barely louder than a breath. But the short version is that these kids needed help sleeping, and no one else seemed to notice. Brian moved into the room with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield, and he looked around at all the specialized sleeping arrangements with wide eyes. "You built all of this?" he asked, and the question contained about 100 other questions beneath it. Amy nodded, and she stretched her arms above her head, and Kevin heard her joints pop from sitting in one position for too long. "I am a pediatric xenobiologist," she said, "and this is literally what I studied for 10 years. And I know what each species needs to feel safe and comfortable. And I just applied that knowledge." "But why?" Kevin asked, and he moved closer and found a spot to sit on the floor near Amy. "And why did you not tell anyone what you were doing?" Amy was quiet for a moment, and she looked around at the sleeping children with an expression that Kevin could only describe as maternal love. "Because I knew how everyone would react," she finally said, "and I knew there would be panic and accusations and fear, and I just wanted these kids to get some rest first." Kevin thought about the chaos in the council chamber and the rage in Commander Thrax's eyes, and he understood what Amy meant. "They think someone kidnapped the children," he said, "and they think something terrible has happened." Amy sighed, and the sound was heavy with exhaustion and worry. "I know," she said, "and I was going to explain everything after they woke up naturally, and I did not want to traumatize them more by having their parents burst in here in a panic." Brian had been examining the Chitrani cocoons, and he turned back to face Amy with an expression of amazement on his face. "These humidity levels are perfect," he said. "And how did you know exactly what they needed?" "I did my research," Amy replied, "and I have files on every species represented on this station, and when the children started coming to me with sleep problems, I looked up what they needed and I built it." "Started coming to you," Kevin repeated. "And so this did not happen all at once." "No," Amy said, and she shook her head. "And it started about 2 weeks ago with little Vrika," and she pointed at the sleeping Valkyrie cub, and she was wandering the corridors during rest cycle looking lost and scared, and I found her and asked what was wrong. "What did she say?" Brian asked, and he had moved closer to listen. Amy smiled sadly, and her eyes got a faraway look as she remembered. "She told me she could not sleep," she said, "and she told me that every time she closed her eyes she felt alone and cold and scared, and her scales were already starting to lose color from the exhaustion." Kevin nodded, because he had noticed that Commander Thrax's scales had been gray with distress, and it made sense that his daughter would have the same reaction on the Valkyrie homeworld. Amy continued, "And cubs sleep in family piles, and they are surrounded by warmth and the heartbeats of their loved ones. But here on the station, Vrika is the only Valkyrie child, and she has no one to sleep with, so you let her sleep here," Brian said, an understanding dawned on his face. "I did more than that," Amy said, and she gestured at the heated blanket nest, "and I researched what Valkyrie cubs need, and I built her a space that feels like home, and I even recorded heartbeat sounds to play quietly while she sleeps." Kevin felt something warm bloom in his chest because this was such a human thing to do, and it was exactly the kind of thing that made him proud to be from Earth. "And the others?" he asked. "And how did they find out?" Amy laughed quietly, and the sound was like bells ringing. "Kids talk," she said, "and even across species they talk." And Vrika told the Luminari younglings about the human who helped her sleep, and they came to me next. "Luminari need darkness," Kevin said, and he was starting to understand the pattern now. "Yes," Amy confirmed, "and young Luminari are sensitive to artificial light cycles, and the station lights are too harsh for them, and they cannot dim themselves properly yet, and so they were suffering. So you built them that dark space," Brian said, and he pointed at the blackout structure near the ceiling. "I did," Amy said, "and I also added some gentle sound frequencies that mimic the cosmic background radiation they would hear in their home nebula, and it helps them feel connected to the universe." Kevin shook his head in amazement because the level of care and research that Amy had put into this was incredible. One by one, the other children came, Amy said, and the Chitrani larvae needed humidity and the sound of clicking, and the Delphini needed to float while hearing heartbeats, and the Scarathi needed height and warmth and stories. "You have been doing this alone for 2 weeks," Brian said. "And why did you not ask for help?" "Because I did not think anyone would understand," Amy said, "and I did not think the other species would trust a human with their children, and I was afraid they would take the kids away and put them back in environments that were hurting them." Kevin reached out and put his hand on Amy's shoulder, and she looked up at him with eyes that were shiny with unshed tears. "You did an amazing thing," he said, but now we need to tell the parents, and they are very worried." "I know," Amy said, and she wiped her eyes, "and I just wanted to let them sleep a little longer, and they were all so tired, Kevin, and you should have seen them when they first came to me, and they were exhausted and scared and lonely." "You saved them," Brian said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight. Amy shook her head, and her expression was humble and kind. "I just paid attention," she said, "and I just saw children who were hurting, and I helped them, and any human would have done the same thing." Kevin stood up, and he looked around the room one more time at all the sleeping alien children, and he felt a surge of pride for his species. "Maybe," he said, "but you are the one who actually did it, and now we need to go explain this to some very worried parents." Amy nodded, and she carefully stood up without disturbing any of the sleeping children, and she followed Kevin and Brian to the doorway, she said, and she turned back and made some adjustments to the various sleeping areas, and she pressed a button that would keep the heartbeat sounds playing, and she made sure the temperature and humidity were stable. Okay, she said finally, and I am ready. Kevin led the way out of the room, and he was already thinking about how to explain this to Commander Thrak and the other alien parents. He had a feeling that this night was going to change everything on Galactic Unity Station, and he was right. The council chamber fell silent when Kevin Park walked in with Dr. Amy Lee and Brian Kim beside him, and every alien in the room turned to stare at the small human woman who looked exhausted but determined. Kevin had sent a brief message ahead saying that the children had been found and were safe, and that everyone needed to come to the council chamber for an explanation, and now he watched as relief and confusion and suspicion battled for control on the faces of the alien parents. Commander Thrak pushed through the crowd, and his massive form towered over Amy like a mountain over a flower, and his red eyes burned with intensity as he looked down at her. "Where is my daughter?" he demanded, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "She is sleeping peacefully in my quarters," Amy said, and her voice did not shake, even though she was facing one of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. "And she is safe and healthy and happy." Thrak stared at her for a long moment, and Kevin could see the conflict in his eyes, because he wanted to believe this tiny human, but he was also terrified and angry and confused. "Why?" he asked, and the single word contained a universe of questions. Amy took a deep breath, and she looked around the room at all the alien parents who were waiting for answers, and she knew that what she said next would determine everything. "Your daughter came to me 2 weeks ago," she began, and her voice was steady and calm, "and she told me she could not sleep, and she told me she felt alone and scared every night, and her scales were turning gray from exhaustion." Thrak flinched at these words, and Kevin saw guilt flash across his scaled face, because he had noticed his daughter's suffering, but had not known how to help on your homeworld. Amy continued, "and Valkyrie cubs sleep together in family piles, and they are surrounded by warmth and love and the sounds of heartbeats, but here on this station your daughter is the only Valkyrie child, and she had no one to sleep with." The massive warrior was silent, and his forearms hung at his sides, and for the first time since Kevin had known him, Thrak looked small and lost. "I thought she needed to be strong," he said quietly, "and I thought I was teaching her independence and self-reliance, and I did not realize I was making her suffer. You were doing what you thought was best," Amy said, and her voice was gentle and kind, "and you were not wrong to want her to be strong, but strength does not mean suffering alone." High Priestess Melody floated forward, and her light was brighter now, but still flickered with worry. "And our younglings?" she asked, "and why did they come to you?" Amy turned to face the being of living light, and she chose her words carefully. "Young Luminari are sensitive to light in ways that adults are not," she explained, "and the artificial light cycles on this station are too harsh for them, and they cannot dim themselves properly yet, and so they were in constant pain." Melody made a sound that might have been a gasp, and her light pulsed with distress. "We did not know," she said, "and we thought they were simply having trouble adjusting the station life." Amy nodded with understanding, in her eyes. "I built them a dark space," she said, "and a place where they can rest without the harsh lights hurting them, and I also added sound frequencies that mimic what they would hear in your home nebula, and it helps them feel connected to something larger than themselves." The Chitrani ambassador clicked forward on his 6 legs, and his compound eyes reflected Amy's image back at her. "Our larvae," he said, and his translator made his voice sound anxious, "and they cannot survive outside proper humidity levels. And how did you keep them alive?" "I researched your species extensively," Amy replied, "and I built humidity-controlled cocoons for them, and I also play recordings of adult Chitrani clicking sounds, because your young need to hear the sounds of their people to develop properly." The insectoid ambassador went very still, and Kevin could not read his expression, but something in his body language suggested shock. "You knew about the developmental clicking," he said, "and even many of our own people do not understand how important that is for larvae, pediatric xenobiologist Amy said, and her smile was tired but proud. And I have spent my entire career studying the needs of young beings from every species, and your children are not that different from each other in many ways. Ambassador Coral rose from her aquatic tube and water cascaded off her dolphin-like body as she spoke. Our swimmers, she said. And how did you provide for them? I connected portable water bubbles to my plumbing system, Amy explained, and the water stays fresh and moving and oxygenated. And I also play heartbeat sounds underwater, because young delphini need to hear the rhythm of a heart to feel safe. Coral made a clicking sound that the translator identified as amazement, and her skin flushed from gray back to healthy blue. Our young are born surrounded by the heartbeats of their pod, she said, and we did not think to recreate that here. Wind dancer of the Scarathi fluttered down from where she had been perched near the ceiling, and her four wings created a gentle breeze as she landed on our fledglings, she asked, and her voice was sharp with concern. And they need height and warmth and proper roosting conditions. I built them a platform near my ceiling, Amy said, and it is heated and padded with synthetic down, and I also tell them stories before they sleep, because young Scarathi need narrative to process their dreams. When dancers' feathers slowly relaxed from their puffed-up state of distress, and she looked at Amy with something like wonder in her avian eyes. You tell them stories, she repeated, and you know that our young cannot rest without stories to guide their dream flights. Amy nodded, and her eyes were warm. I read everything I could find about your species, she said, and I wanted to understand what your children needed, and I wanted to help them. The room was silent for a long moment, and Kevin watched as the alien parents processed what they had heard, and he could see something changing in their faces. Commander Thrak was the first to speak, and his voice was different now, and softer and more vulnerable than Kevin had ever heard. You did all of this, he said, and you spent weeks caring for our children, and you received nothing in return. And why? Amy looked up at the massive warrior, and her answer was simple and honest. Because they needed help, she said, and because I saw children who were suffering, and I could not walk away from that, and no human could. Melody drifted closer, and her light had changed to a warm golden color that Kevin recognized as deep emotion. Your species, she said slowly, and we have always thought humans were the soft ones and the weak ones, and the ones who felt too much. Amy smiled, and it was a tired smile, but also a proud one. We do feel too much, she agreed, and we cannot help it. And when we see someone hurting, especially a child, we have to help. And it is not a choice for us. It is just who we are. Thrak looked around the room at the other alien parents, and Kevin could see a silent conversation happening between them. And when Thrak turned back to face Amy, his red eyes had changed. I would like to see my daughter, he said, and his voice was gentle now. And I would like to see where she has been sleeping so peacefully. Amy nodded, and she turned to lead the way out of the council chamber, and Kevin watched as all the alien parents followed her in a procession of scales and light and feathers and fins. This was not what anyone had expected when the alarm had sounded hours ago, and this was not the ending that anyone had imagined. But as Kevin followed the group through the corridors toward the human residential wing, he felt something warm in his chest, because this was a good ending, and maybe even a beginning of something new. The alien parents moved quietly through the hallways, and their earlier panic had been replaced by curiosity and hope. And when they finally reached Amy's quarters and the door slid open, Kevin heard a dozen different sounds of amazement, because the sight of 12 alien children sleeping peacefully in a room that one small human had transformed into a sanctuary for all of them was something that none of them would ever forget. Commander Thrak stepped forward, and his heavy footsteps were impossibly gentle as he approached the heated blanket nest where his daughter slept. He stood there for a long moment just watching her breathe, and Kevin saw a single tear roll down his scaled face and hiss as it evaporated against his warm skin. "Thank you," Thrak said, and the words were barely a whisper, but they echoed through the room like thunder. Amy just nodded, and she stood back and let the parents have their moment with their sleeping children, and she did not ask for anything in return because that was not why she had done it. She had done it because they needed help, and that was enough. The children slept for 3 more hours while their parents watched over them, and during that time something remarkable happened in Amy Lee's quarters. Kevin Park stood in the corner and observed as alien species that had barely tolerated each other for years began to talk, and not just the formal diplomatic talking that happened in council chambers, but real honest conversation. Commander Thrak sat on the floor near his daughter's nest, and his massive form looked strange in such a humble position, but he did not seem to care, and his red eyes kept drifting back to little Vrika, as if he could not believe she was real. And Sci-Fi have failed her, he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him something. High Priestess Melody floated nearby, and her light had settled into a steady, warm glow, and she responded with kindness that surprised Kevin. We have all failed, Thrak, she said, and we were so focused on raising our young according to our traditions that we forgot to ask what they actually needed. The Shitrani ambassador clicked in agreement, and his antennae waved slowly back and forth. On our homeworld, he said, and larvae are surrounded by thousands of adults at all times, and the sound of clicking is constant, and they are never alone. But here we placed them in isolated pods and expected them to thrive. Ambassador Coral made a soft whistling sound from inside her portable water tank that one of the human crew members had brought for her. We told our young swimmers to be brave, she said, and we told them that the silence of space was something they needed to accept. And we did not realize that silence was slowly breaking their spirits. Wine Dancer preened her feathers nervously, and her eyes kept darting to the ceiling where her fledglings slept. We expected them to fly before they were ready, she admitted, and we pushed them to be independent. When what they needed was someone to hold them close and tell them stories. Kevin listened to all of this, and he felt a strange mixture of sadness and hope, because these parents had made mistakes, but they were also willing to admit those mistakes, and that was the first step toward fixing them. Dr. Amy Lee had been quiet during this conversation, and she had been checking on each of the sleeping children and adjusting their environments and making sure they were comfortable. And finally, she came to sit near the group of parents. May I say something, she asked, and her voice was soft, but everyone immediately gave her their attention. Please, Thrak said, and his voice held none of the anger or suspicion from before, and now it held only respect. Amy looked around at the gathered alien parents, and she chose her words carefully. Your traditions are not wrong, she said, and the ways you were raised, and the ways your ancestors raised their young for thousands of generations, those ways have value and meaning. But Melody said, and her light flickered with confusion. But Amy continued, and traditions were created for specific environments and for specific circumstances, and when you brought your children to this station, you placed them in an environment that your traditions never anticipated. Kevin nodded, because he understood what Amy was saying, and it was brilliant and kind, and exactly right on your homeworlds, Amy said, and your parenting methods work perfectly, and they have worked for countless generations. But this station is not your homeworld, and your children are growing up in a place that is new and strange and different. Thrak was silent for a long moment, and his scales shifted through several colors as he processed this information. You are saying, he said slowly, and that we need to adapt our ways and not abandon them but change them for this new environment. Exactly, Amy said, and her smile was warm and encouraging. And your daughter does not need to stop being Valkyrie, and she does not need to forget your warrior traditions, but she also needs comfort and warmth and the feeling of not being alone. Wine Dancer tilted her head in that sharp bird-like way that meant deep thought. How did you know all of this, she asked, and how did you understand our children better than we did? Because I listened to them, Amy said simply, and they told me what they needed, and all I had to do was pay attention. The room went quiet again, and Kevin could see the impact of those words on every parent present, because it was such a simple thing. And yet somehow they had all missed it. They told me they were scared. Amy continued, and they told me they were lonely, and they told me that the things that were supposed to make them feel safe actually made them feel worse, and I just believe Thamthrak made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "We are warriors," he said, "and we are taught to push through pain and discomfort, and to never show weakness, and I raised my daughter the same way, and there is value in strength." Amy agreed, but there is also value in knowing when to rest and when to ask for help, and your daughter is learning both now. The Chitrani ambassador stepped forward on his 6 legs, and his compound eyes glittered in the soft light. "In my culture," he said, "and asking for help is seen as failure, and we are expected to solve all problems on our own. I have taught my larvae this lesson from the moment they hatched." Amy nodded with understanding. "Many species share that belief," she said, "but humans see things differently, and for us, asking for help is not weakness, and it is wisdom, and it is knowing that we are stronger together than alone." Coral made a thoughtful sound from her water. "Thank you, species," she said, "and you are known as pack bonders and creatures who form attachments to everything around you, and we have often considered this a weakness." Kevin smiled, because he had heard this criticism of humans many times before. "It is not weakness," he said, and speaking for the first time in a while, "and it is our greatest strength, and when we care about someone or something, we will move mountains to protect it." Amy pointed around the room at all the sleeping arrangements she had built. "I did not do this because I had to," she said, "and I was not ordered to help these children, and no one paid me or rewarded me, and I did it because I saw children who were hurting, and I could not stand by and do nothing." "Why?" Thrak asked, and his voice was genuinely curious now. "And why could you not simply walk away?" "Because that is not how humans are built," Amy said. "And when we see suffering, we feel it too, and the pain of others becomes our pain, and the only way to make it stop is to help." Melody floated closer, and her light wrapped around Amy like a gentle embrace. "Your empathy," she said, "and it is not just an emotion for you, and it is a physical experience." "Yes," Amy agreed, "and we literally cannot ignore the suffering of others, and it hurts us to try. And so we help because it is the only way to feel whole again." Alien parents looked at each other, and Kevin could see something changing in their expressions, and they were beginning to understand something fundamental about humanity. "We have always wondered," Ambassador Coral said, "and why humans form bonds with other species so easily, and why you adopt pets and form friendships across cultural lines, and why you seem to care about everyone you meet." Amy smiled, and her tired eyes sparkled with warmth. "Now you know," she said, "and we cannot help it, and we see a child in pain, and we have to fix it, and we see someone lonely, and we have to reach out, and it is not a choice, and it is just who we are." Rack stood up slowly, and his massive form cast a shadow over Amy, but there was nothing threatening in his posture now. "I have spent my life," he said, "and believing that emotions were weakness, and that caring too much made you vulnerable, and that the strongest warriors were the ones who felt nothing." "And now," Amy asked gently, "now," Thrak said, and he looked down at his sleeping daughter with love in his red eyes. "And now I think perhaps the humans have been right all along, and perhaps caring deeply is the greatest strength of all." The first child to wake was little Rika, and she stretched her scaled limbs and yawned, showing rows of tiny sharp teeth. And then she saw her father standing nearby, and her eyes went wide. "Papa," she said, and her voice was small and scared. "And am I in trouble?" Thrak knelt down beside her, and for the first time in Kevin's memory, the fearsome Velkori warrior pulled his daughter into a gentle embrace. "No, little one," he said, and his voice cracked with emotion, "and you are not in trouble, and I am sorry, and I am so sorry. I did not understand what you needed." Rika wrapped her 4 small arms around her father's neck, and she held on tight, and Kevin had to look away because the moment was too private and too Beautiful to watch. One by one, the other children began to wake, and one by one their parents gathered them up. With new understanding in their hearts, and Kevin knew that this night had changed everything. Not just for the children, and not just for the parents, but for the entire station, and maybe for the entire galaxy, because tonight the aliens had learned something important about humans, and that lesson would echo through the stars for generations to come. 3 months had passed since the night when 12 alien children were found sleeping peacefully in Dr. Amy Lee's quarters, and Galactic Unity Station had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. Kevin Park walked through the newly expanded section of the station that had once been the human residential wing, and he smiled as he passed through the doors of what everyone now called the nest. The original space had grown from Amy's small quarters into a massive complex that took up an entire deck of the station, and it had become the most popular place on the entire facility for beings of all ages and species. Dr. Amy Lee now led a team of 23 staff members, including 12 humans and 11 aliens from various species, and they worked in shifts around the clock to keep the nest running smoothly. Kevin found Amy in the central hub of the complex, and she was surrounded by a group of mixed species children who were listening with wide eyes as she told them a story about a brave little starship that was afraid of the dark. The children sat together in a pile that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago, and Valkyrie cubs leaned against Delphini swimmers, and Skyrthy fledglings had their wings draped over. Chitrani larvae and Luminara younglings glowed softly as they snuggled close to everyone else. When Amy finished her story, the children scattered to play, and she turned to greet Kevin with a warm smile. "Ambassador Park," she said, and her voice was playful. "And what brings you to the nest today?" Kevin laughed because Amy always teased him about his formal title. "I came to see how things are going," he said, and to bring you some news from the council." Amy raised an eyebrow, and she gestured for him to follow her to a quiet corner where they could talk without disturbing the children. "The council has voted," Kevin said, "and they want to officially recognize the nest as an essential station facility, and they want to increase your budget by 300%. Amy blinked in surprise, and for a moment she seemed lost for words. "That is a lot of money," she finally said. "And are you sure they meant to approve that much?" Kevin smiled, and he remembered the council meeting where the vote had taken place. "Commander Thrak made the proposal," he said, and he gave a speech about how the nest had changed his relationship with his daughter, and about how the alien species had learned something important from humans. "What did he say?" Amy asked, and her eyes were curious. "He said," Kevin replied, "and that humans taught the galaxy that caring deeply is not weakness, and that asking for help is not failure, and that the strongest communities are the ones where everyone looks after everyone else." Amy was quiet for a moment, and Kevin could see emotions playing across her face. "I did not mean to teach anyone anything," she said softly, "and I just wanted to help some kids sleep. That is exactly why it worked," Kevin said, "and you were not trying to prove a point or make a political statement, and you just saw children who needed help and you helped them." They were interrupted by a small voice calling out, and Kevin turned to see Daniel Thompson running toward them, and Daniel was a 14-year-old human boy whose parents worked as engineers on the station. "Dr. Amy," Daniel said excitedly, "and Vrika and I finished building the new reading corner, and do you want to come see it?" Amy smiled at the boy, and Kevin noticed how comfortable Daniel seemed in the nest, and how naturally he interacted with the alien children who had become his friends. "Show me," she said, and she let Daniel take her hand and lead her across the complex. Kevin followed, and he watched as they entered a cozy corner that had been decorated with cushions and blankets and soft lights, and the walls were covered with art that the children had made together, and it was beautiful in its chaos. Vrika stood proudly in the center of the reading corner, and the young Valkyrie had grown in the past 3 months, and her scales were now a healthy shiny black, and she no longer looked tired or afraid. "Daniel helped me build the shelves," she announced, "and we made them at different heights so everyone can reach the books." The two Young people had become inseparable friends, and Kevin knew that their parents had been worried at first about a Valkyrie warrior cub befriending a human boy, but those worries had faded quickly. Rika protected Daniel, and Daniel made Rika laugh. And together, they had started organizing activities for the younger children, and they had become unofficial leaders of the nest. Commander Thrak appeared in the doorway, and his massive form still looked out of place in such a soft and colorful environment, but he no longer seemed uncomfortable. Daughter, he called out, and it is time for our training session. Rika looked disappointed, but she nodded obediently, and she started to leave, but then she stopped and ran back to give Daniel a quick hug before hurrying to her father. Kevin watched as the fearsome Valkyrie warrior and his young daughter walked away together, and he noticed that Thrak had one of his forearms wrapped gently around Rika's shoulders. "That is new," Amy said softly, and she had appeared beside Kevin, and she was watching the same scene with a satisfied smile. Kevin nodded because he had noticed the changes in the Valkyrie commander over the past 3 months, and the warrior was still fierce and dangerous when he needed to be, but he had also learned to be gentle with his daughter. "The other species have changed too," Amy continued, "and they come to the nest regularly now, and not just to drop off their children, but to spend time here themselves." Kevin had noticed this as well, and he had seen High Priestess Melody floating through the nest and sharing stories with the children about the cosmic wonders of the universe, and he had seen Ambassador Coral teaching young swimmers how to create beautiful patterns in the water, and he had seen Wind Dancer demonstrating flight techniques to any child who wanted to learn. Aliens were learning from the humans, but Kevin realized that the humans were learning too. "Our people," Amy said, "and we spend so much time trying to prove ourselves to the galaxy and trying to show that we are strong and capable and worthy of respect. But maybe what makes us special is not any of that." "What makes us special?" Kevin asked, though he already knew the answer. "This," Amy said, and she gestured around at the nest and at the children playing together, and at the parents who had learned to show their love more openly. "And this is what makes us special, and we see someone hurting and we help, and it is that simple." A group of children ran past them laughing and playing some kind of game that seemed to involve a lot of jumping and spinning, and Kevin could not tell who was winning, but everyone seemed happy that night. There was a celebration in the nest, and representatives from every species on the station came to mark the official recognition of the facility, and Kevin stood at the back of the room and watched as Amy received award after award and praise from beings who had once looked down on humans as soft and weak. But the moment that Kevin would remember forever came at the end of the ceremony, when all the children gathered together to present Amy with a gift they had made themselves. It was a book, and the cover was decorated with drawings from every child in the nest, and inside were stories and pictures and messages of love and gratitude. Little Vreka stepped forward to speak for the group, and the young Valkyrie held the book carefully in her 4 small hands. "You helped us," she said, and her voice was clear and strong, "and when we were scared and lonely and hurting, you helped us. And you did not care what species we were, and you just cared that we needed help." Amy knelt down to accept the book, and Kevin could see tears streaming down her face. And she pulled Vreka into a hug, and then suddenly she was surrounded by children of all species, and they were all hugging her and laughing and crying. Kevin felt Brian Kim step up beside him, and the security chief had a strange expression on his face. "You know," Brian said quietly, "and I have been in law enforcement for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of things. But I have never seen anything change this station the way one small woman with some blankets and lullabies did." Kevin nodded, because he felt the same way. "That is the power of humans," he said. "And we are not the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced species in the galaxy, but we are the ones who cannot walk past someone in pain without stopping to help." Brian was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke again. "Do you think the other species really understand now?" he asked. Kevin looked around the room at all the different beings who had gathered together, and he saw Valkyrie warriors holding their children gently. And he saw luminary parents dimming their lights to match their younglings. And he saw Chitrani adults clicking softly to comfort their larvae. And he saw Delphini swimmers floating peacefully beside their young. And he saw Skarathi parents telling stories to their fledglings. Yes, Kevin said finally, and I think they understand, and I think they finally see what makes humans special. And what is that? Brian asked. Kevin smiled as he watched Amy surrounded by the children who loved her. We care, he said simply, and about everything and everyone, and we cannot help it, and it is hardwired into us at the deepest level. Brian nodded, and they stood together watching the celebration somewhere out there in the vast darkness between stars 17. Different species would eventually share this story with their homeworlds, and they would tell their people about the small human woman who could not ignore suffering children, and they would explain that humans were not weak for feeling so much, but were actually the strongest species of all, because in a galaxy full of warriors and scholars and ancient races with technology beyond imagination, the humans had discovered the ultimate weapon: unconditional love.